Sign ordinance compliance. This is a quick preview of something that we've discussed at partners meeting that as a company we want to try to make an effort to improve the practice locally. Non-compliant signs in terms of illegal placement of signs is really epidemic. And I listed some of the most common examples. You get signs in the parkways. Any sign in the parkway anytime is illegal. And the parkway doesn't just apply if you see a sidewalk and it's on the street side of the sidewalk. The city still has a right-of-way that corresponds to some distance beyond the edge of a given road, even in places where there is not a sidewalk. Now, when there's a sidewalk, that makes it relatively clear. If it's on the inside of the sidewalk, it's the private property. If it's on the street side, it's not. When there is no sidewalk, it's not nearly as clear. We had one out of the blue ordinance. It was a letter, so there was no fine attached to it, but it was a letter, a notice of violation letter sent to us that a sign had already been plucked and that we were in violation, and it was in a Champaign location, residential location. It was on site. It wasn't a directional sign posted somewhere else. It was on the premises, and there was no sidewalk, and the violation was that it was in the public right-of-way. Enforcement, in my experience, has been extremely rare and sporadic, and I've personally never had one plucked that I can think of. So that was really unusual, particularly in the case of a house where it was not at all easy to tell where that was. So anyway, just be aware, it's illegal to have them anywhere in the parkway, both on the property you're trying to advertise, the parkway that's adjacent to the property you're trying to advertise, but as well as arrow signs. Now, in some areas, you have, Champaign doesn't have an express prohibition against arrow signs, but this is one of the things that I was reading at 1 o'clock this morning after putting together a different presentation that I did an hour and a half ago. But in the City of Champaign ordinance, there's not an express provision that says arrow or directional signs that are off-site are illegal. But what it says with respect to real estate signs is they may be displayed only so long as the property is on the market and for up to 10 days after. And so really, it stands to reason that if it's anywhere off-site, it's on someone's property who's not on the market and isn't within 10 days of a closing. So probably by inference, directional signs are illegal, even if you knock on the door and put them on someone's private property. Now, the practical reality is, I am not aware of anyone anywhere in any of our area municipalities who goes out and zealously enforces signage ordinances for open house directional signs. Those extremely short duration signs, there seems to be very, very widespread acceptance of those. And in some cases, you'll find that those are actually, in the case of Muhammad, interestingly, which has, comparing it to Champaign, for example, Muhammad has a pretty lengthy ordinance, which Caitlin and I have recently become experts in. But you get a very express prohibition. It actually says arrow signs, refers to them as arrow signs. If it is off premises, in other words, if it's not a sign for sale on the property being marketed for sale, it is expressly prohibited under the statute. There's a carve-out for open house signage. So be aware that in general, even if there's no carve-out for open house signage, I'm not aware of any municipality that goes out and tries to pluck a sign that's been there for 72 hours that you put up on Wednesday that's advertising the open house that's that coming Sunday. Anything else, though, that you put out there, whether it's on private property or not, is likely illegal. In addition to the illegality issue of it, one of the things to be aware of is ask yourself what the practical effect is of littering the landscape with directional signs. So, as I said, some agents plaster the entire landscape with directional signs. You'll see them going for blocks or even a mile or miles in some cases away from the property being advertised. So in addition, setting aside the fact that those signs are illegal most of the time, what happens is it creates a misleading impression of market share, because if you wallpaper the entire landscape with your signs everywhere, people see it all over the place. Well, then what happens is other agents' competitive juices start flowing and they decide, well, I'm not going to let that person get away with that. I'm going to do it myself. And then everybody does it. And then you can think of the entrances to some of our community's nicest subdivisions where you've got 3 or 4 directional signs in various states of being crooked, being nice metal signage, being corrugated plastic on a flimsy stake. And it's just a forest of them. And they're all illegal. And one was illegal enough, and then you get a forest of them that's really hideous. And also, it gets you closer and closer to a tipping point at which people like subdivision homeowners associations will start to intervene. And I think it's very bad for us to get to the point that we have those HOAs intervening. What would make a lot more sense is if the enforcement, which is driven on the basis of complaints, were made more uniform. And I'm going to talk more about this in coming weeks, but what I'd like to see as a company is our agents focus on strict compliance with the letter of the law. The only non-compliant, potentially non-compliant part would be directionals for open houses. But beyond that, I'd like to see our company and all of our agents migrate towards strict compliance with this, because if we start to make the complaints and demand the removal of the illegal signs, and we play by the rules and start to demand that the city enforce those rules so everybody else does, we'll be the net beneficiaries. And the reason is the people that are the most blatant scofflaws are the ones who get a disproportionate benefit from breaking the law, which is, well, instead of having one sign up in one yard, I got 6 signs up, all for the one listing. Well, our company's market share, of course, is 10 percentage points ahead of the second place player in the market, and 15 percentage points ahead of the third place player in the market. I mean, we are far and away the market leading firm. We have far and away the highest inventory. And so if everybody has to play by the rules and nobody is able to get away with putting directional signs all over the place, who's going to come out the net winner when that happens? We will, because if you have one sign per listing on the market and we've got a huge advantage in the market share, we're going to ultimately win, and we will have been complying with the law, so we're not going to be part of the problem, and we won't be contributing to a form of urban blight. And Max Mitchell is the one who has mentioned the term, it's a form of blight. Realtors are now responsible for creating their own form of blight. One of the reasons, a bunch of the reasons why directional signs aren't really helpful in 2013 is, other than open houses, how many of us and our clients really, truly depend on the directional sign to find the house. Now, in certain rural areas, I think there's a stronger argument to be made, or if you're in a rare situation where you know the GPS routing is problematic or simply dead wrong. I had my wife drive off the closest thing we have to a cliff in rural Muhammad a number of years ago because she was coming back from the north on I-57, and my subdivision is at the north end of Lake of the Woods Road. A lot of the GPS nav systems show that Lake of the Woods Road continues down into the floodplain of the Sangamon River Valley and winds on through the countryside, which has not been publicly accessible for years, and then connects to either 2400 or 2425. So my wife's coming from the north, headed back home. Her GPS advises her to get off the interstate at Rantoul, drive to the countryside, turn on 24 or 2425, whichever it was. So she's cruising along on a straightaway at 55 or 60 miles an hour, and the road oil and chip just ends, and there's a substantial drop-off. So she had the kids with her, and they got home, and the kids, first thing, Dad, guess what? Mommy drove the car off a cliff. Really? Let's talk to Mommy about that. So anyway, except for cases like that, where you know that there's an issue with a mapping error on the publicly accessible websites for, truly a Zillow, Realtor.com, Remax.com, or where you know that general GPS systems aren't using the most logical way. Short of something exceptional like that, directional signs don't help. It's not what people depend on to find the property. If they're using the directions field in the MLS, that of course is on the customer display as well. So when you're emailing your clients the listings, they'll see that, and that's what I still depend on more than anything else. So they don't really help. Consumer apps on mobile devices are geosensitive. So you launch the app, you're seeing where you are on the map, and you're seeing a bunch of push pins on a map, so it's pretty obvious where you go. And of course, if you're already on a mobile device that's got GPS functionality, then you're going to be using that if you don't know where it is to find your way from where you are now to where the property is. So the directional signs have never been less useful than they are today. And the problem in our local market in terms of people ramping up this kind of crazy competition of who can throw the most tacky directional signs out the most places. I think rolling that back and making sure that we get ourselves into strict compliance is sensible from a legal standpoint, from a good citizen standpoint, and from a practical standpoint. And I think only when we get ourselves to that point does it make sense for us to all start calling the city to file a complaint and say, hey, you got an illegal sign that's been parked here for the last 3 weeks. It needs to go. Any questions?
So, for all the people who have missed this meeting today, do we constructively start, policing other agents saying your sign should not be here?
Yeah. Yes, the answer is yes. So right now, I don't want to go after this with a Nazi-like level of zeal, especially when I'm talking to 6 of you and we got 60 people. So it's something we're going to talk about over the course of at least the next few weeks. It's something that we'll make sure we get some written notice out to all of the agents in the office so that everyone's aware of it, so that, in another month or 2, we'll be in a spot where we can start encouraging our agents to make calls. I know the Village of Mahomet, which has a really, really strict sign ordinance and has a very explicit prohibition against off-site directional signs, very strict prohibition against it, still is complaint-driven. And the reality is Mahomet, for its smallish population, is a sprawling municipality. So my neighborhood is kind of the northern outpost of the village boundaries. And when I was at a sign-related variance hearing that Caitlin and I got to sit through, I had mentioned that I was jumping through all the hoops I needed to jump through and paying hundreds of dollars in fees to seek a variance to make a sign of mine legal in Mahomet. And on my way from my home to the hearing, I passed a dozen illegal signs. And the village staffer even said, "What area are you in?" I said, "Oh, I can't even remember the last time I was up there." So it is complaint driven. So once we get ourselves into strict compliance, I think we as individual agents, we as a firm, will want to start to politely police that by, of course, don't hesitate. If it's an agent that you have a good rapport with, we don't want to necessarily, put the smackdown on them by tattling to the municipality first. If it's somebody call them and say, "Hey, we've made an effort to try to bring all of our signage into strict compliance with the law. Yours is illegal, and we're starting to actually file complaints with the city to make sure everyone's on an even playing field." You want to add anything, Max? Because this is your brainchild.
I think it's a great idea to start being proactive versus reactive.
So we got to make sure we all get into compliance so we can move forward on that.